All right, so in this video, we're going to start implementing a collision system. We already have a collision component, so let me go into it, that will hold a collided entity. And right now we're using the collision manager, which is basically using Box2D. So when a contact happens, we're going to find out which fixture and who it belongs to. And that fixture is going to let us know when an entity has collided. So we will have an entity that collided with another entity, and that will become our collision entity. So then we can set the collided entity to who collided with who. So if, say, our player was the first one and he collided with something else, another entity, that's what we can set for our Ashley. So we can have it collide and start dealing with the collisions for if it was an enemy that he collided with, to start dealing with health. If it was a collectible like a coin or a power-up or something, we could actually start looking for those things and then deal with it. Okay, so we already have some stuff in place, but now we want to actually capture what is going on with that collision. We are also using the type component. So the type, we are setting the type of the entity when we are creating it in our entity manager. So right now we've only created the player. But as we start adding more entities, let me go back up to the top. As we start adding more entities, we're building from the layer of the entities, but we're passing in the name and then their X and Y position. So we're able to build from Box2D. Now, there are instances, though, when we're spawning that we really only have the player, which is we're putting in that type component. So as we start adding more entities in here, we're going to have to start dealing with them. So let's check our level collision generator to see if we're also setting the type for that. So when we are building our world from not Box2D, from the tiled, we're taking all of those shapes and we're creating Box2D shapes for it. But we are also using that information to create the type that we're storing in a component for that entity, what type it is. Specifically, it's a level. So even though we are setting the flags and how we want stuff to interact, whether it's going to interact or go right through it, the mask bits and the category bits for Box2D, we still have to manage this, but we also need to say, since we're using a collision manager, what we are going to do with those collisions. Okay, so that's what we are going to set up in this video, and if it goes too long, we're going to do it in another one. So we're going to go to System. We're going to create a new system. And we're just going to call this one the collision system. Okay, and this system is going to extend the iterating system because we want to go through every entity that's in it. Okay, and we need to import, we need to implement the methods, which specifically there's only one, the process entity. Okay. There are a couple things that we're going to have. So let me do a constructor first. Actually, let's talk about what we need. So for a collision system, we're going to have the pooled engine, because if we need to destroy some of the entities when they interact, we're going to need to be able to deal with that. We're going to have to deal with the Box2D world for being able to remove any entities if there are any. The Box2D fixtures and shapes. We will eventually have to implement an asset manager, texture regions, and an atlas, but we do need holding on our player. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And we need an instance of the game. So I'm going to do Redbeard run. I'm going to call game. Okay, so those are all set up. Now let's look at our constructor for this. The constructor is going to need, and we're not passing in a family, but we are going to need that pooled engine, the world. We could pass in an entity of our player, and we want to pass in the game. So we're going to select all of these. Now the super family is only going to go through, so we're not actually passing in a family. You could build these ahead of time, but we know that the collision system is not going to run on any bodies, any entities that does not have a collision component. So family.all, and then we're going to look for the collision component. Helps if I spell it right. Collision component dot class dot get. Okay, so we're getting all the entities that have a collision component, and then our process entity is going to go through every single entity that has a collision component that we are going to deal with. Okay, so there's going to be a couple things that we're going to have. We're going to need to have the collision component. Let me just call it collision. And let's use our mappers. Mappers dot collision component dot get, and then we are passing in the entity. Okay, so we have the collision component. What else do we need? We are going to just pull the entity from the collided entity. So from that collision component, we're going to pull the collision out of it. So I'm going to do collision.get collided entity. That's going to be our collided entity that we collided with. We are going to need to have a couple instances of the type component. So I'm going to type up type component, and I'm going to do this type for the entity that did the colliding, and then we're going to have to probably have another one for who collided with who. So we're going to do entity.get component type component dot class. All right, and for debugging, let's go ahead and just make a string, and we're going to call it tag and leave it go. We're going to have an instance of that player component, so we can pull the player component equals mappers dot player component dot get entity. Okay, so this will not error out until I try to use it. It could return back null. But there may be times when I know it's the player, I can check to make sure that it's not null and then deal with it. We're going to need to have our state component so that we could deal if we wanted him to be injured or not. So let's do state mappers dot state component dot get entity. We're going to have our body component. Body equals mappers body component dot get entity, and we don't have steering or sound set up yet. Okay, so that should be what we would need to be able to start this. Now, that entity that gets passed in, it's going to have a collision component, and then we can pull the entity for who it collided from. We can also pull the type that the entity that we're using to check. So let's start building that. So we're going to have a if this type dot get type is equal to the type component We didn't set it that way in this one. If it is an instance of, let's see, we put it in as the figures right here. So we're looking for the player. Okay, so our collision system, so if the type is equal to the, let's do figures dot player. So that's saying the entity that we're dealing with right now at this moment is the player, and we're checking to see if he collided with something. So if that collided entity is not null, well, we could say if it is null, then we could return. Okay. And then, so that's just kind of our guard to deal with it. Now, if the collided entity, now we need to find out what type we actually collided with. So if we got to here, then we did not, there is an entity that we collided with, and we want to try to pull that type. So now I'm going to create another type component that we're going to be pulling from. So let's call it collided type. Is what we actually just collided with. So we know that that collided entity is not null. So I can say collided entity dot get component, and we could pull the type component from that entity. Oops. Okay. So now we have that type component. We could start checking. So if that entity that we collided with, now we're assuming that it has a type component, so we want to check. So again, we're going to have to come here and do another guard statement. So if that collided type is null, we need to return, because we're not going to process it. Otherwise, we are going to be dealing with what the type is. So here is where we could actually open up a switch, which might be more effective for us. So a switch, and we want to go off of that collided type, and we want to deal with the different types that we have. So let me put some space. So let's say that the type that we had, let's start building some cases. So if that type component, or excuse me, if that type that we collided with is a figures dot, let's say enemy, we're going to deal with it a specific way. Break. If that type is a level, then we're going to deal with it a specific way. And if we don't know what it is, we're going to deal with it a specific way. So this will start growing as we end up having more entities that we're dealing with. So this would be the switch that we're going to, as long as the entity is the player and we're colliding with something else. Okay, so we can start dealing with health and doing sound effects and all that stuff. For now, let's just go ahead and we're going to just log. So GDX, we don't have a tag for this yet. So let's set a tag. Okay, so here at the top, we know that it's the player. So I'm going to set my tag as equal to, let's do player collision. Okay, so then we can start logging something. So gdx.app log, and we're going to do our tag, and then we're going to say who it interacted with. So the player collision with the enemy. Okay, and then I'm going to copy this. This way we can kind of debug and we can remove it if we don't need it. All right, so if we collided with the level, let's go ahead and say level. And then we want to know if we didn't plug something in correctly, if it was just labeled as other as a default. So we want to do other. Okay, so that will deal with us when we're dealing with the player actually colliding. But now we need to deal with if it is not the player, but let's say an enemy that we are colliding with. We're going to have to build that type. So this, if it is the player, we are going to deal with all of this stuff. So if it is not the player, so else if we are dealing with another entity that is not the player, then we're going to have to check for this type. So this type dot get type is equal to, let's say, figures dot enemy. Okay, so if the enemy collided, now I can reset my tag. It's equal to enemy collision. This way, if the enemy is getting hit by something that was what collided, then we could deal with health and stuff from the enemy itself is what is going to be happening. So like if I collide with the enemy, I'm losing health, then I can have separately, I can have the enemy if it collided to deal with that. So we're not double taking, but we still want to be able to deal with the collision. We don't know which one is going to be the primary collision, so we want to deal with each situation. So as long as that collided entity is not null, so we're going to deal with that. So collided entity, which could be the player, is null. We want to no longer process. Okay. So now let's pull the type component from the, so I'm going to do collided type. Oh, it doesn't want us to create again. Well, what am I doing? So this is still the collided type from the collided entity. I know I'm doing it twice, but if I just create that collided entity, the collided type up here, which I could do, you're going to have to make sure that you're pulling it for each one. So I could do, since now I know that I'm going to have both of them, let's go ahead, and as long as we are making ourselves specific, time component, and I'm going to do collided type, and then just initialize here with the value. Okay. And I could further do that up from the entity up here and just make sure that it's not null for the type. Okay, so after I have my collided entity, then I want to make sure it's not null. So if collided type is null, then we want to return. We don't want to process. If it is not, then we're going to still be in here, so that now we could build our switch. So let's do another switch, and inside of this we're going to be looking for that collided type that interacted with us. So dot get type, and then we're going to start dealing with our cases. So in the case of the enemy, the enemy could collide with another enemy. So we got to deal with what's going to happen there. The enemy could interact with the level, so we're going to deal with what happens there. The enemy could collide with the player. We're going to have to deal with what happens there. The enemy could collide with something that wasn't labeled correctly, so let's put an other. Okay, and Control-Alt-L to reformat. Now we're going to end up printing a debug line so we know. So enemy collision enemy, enemy collision level, enemy collision player, and enemy collision other. Okay. So all of those we could start dealing with the different situations. Every time we add a new type of entity, we're going to have to deal with what happens. So let's say that the player interacts with an enemy weapon. If that weapon also has a collision component on it, then we're going to have the weapon interact with the player. So maybe the player is losing health from the weapon, but the weapon is losing durability from being used. So we would have to deal with that. Okay. So for all of those, I mean, that's basically it. Once we start adding more things, like let's say a friendly, like an NPC, then we're going to have to deal with what happens to that entity. So this would start building out our stuff. The only way to test it, though, is you'd have to go in your tiled map and you're going to have to create another entity. So in your entity manager, let's look at what we would need. So right now we're spawning an entity. Our group ends up looking through for the spawn property, and then is pulling the entity name from that. So if we wanted to have that entity name be used to build another entity, let's go through, and that's why we started building it like this. So if the entity is, let's say, enemy, and I could have multiple enemies to have different interactions, let's go ahead and build that. And let's go ahead and build case, let's say coin. Now, we're limited on how many different short types we could use. So if we end up having coins and things like that, I ended up building those as like an interactive, so we could delve down farther down. So if they interacted with they collided with an interactive, then I could check what that interactive was and then deal with it in my collided case. So let's just say enemy, and then let's just say coin, and we can start building up from there. So an enemy is going to have a body component, so we can add that method, and we're going to pass in our stuff for our enemy. Just go to my reference right here. Okay, so a lot of our stuff could end up being built almost the same. Enemies, we could have, almost all of them are having certain things, so we could have multiple cases for them. But we know that the body component is going to have the entity name, the X, and the Y, okay, that we're passing in. Type component is going to have, and we're going to have to modify all of these. It's going to have the entity and then the entity name that we're using to build it. The enemy is going to have a collision component. So if I Did it need something to know if it collided with something else? Like I would want to know if the player collided with the level, but I don't really need to know if the level collided with anything, unless maybe I needed to destroy part of the level and have it interact. So let's build for the enemy. We're going to have a collision component. We don't need to have a player component. We might want to add an enemy component. But we do want to add a state component. So entity and entity name. All right, so let's go in each one of these, and we're going to have to check. So add body component, it's checking in this switch for the entity name. So we have case player. Now we need case enemy. Now if you're going to have a more specific name for which type of enemy, we could do that. And we are going to set a lot of this the same. So let's go ahead and build that out. Our category bits is not going to be player, it's going to be the enemy. So we're going to put that. Enemy can collide with another enemy, could collide with the level, could also collide with the player. So figures.player. We have our size vectors for it. Our body component is going to be built. We're setting as active. We're setting our linear dampening, and then we're setting how we're going to control the body. That's basically it using that. Unless we needed a specific shape or anything, that's where we could kind of set it. And we could do this via JSON and could make it a little bit easier to create other stuff. But it's kind of a preference thing. So we're kind of dealing with it programmatically. So we did the body component. Let's go back to the add entity. So I don't want to do that. So we're spawning our entity. We added the body. Let's go ahead and add the type. Get off. That's annoying. Okay, so our type, we have player right now. We're going to end up having another one, which is going to be if it's an enemy, we want to label it as an enemy. So type is equal to figures dot enemy. And this is not for interacting, it's for being able to pull the data from when they're interacting. And I want to break and add that to my player. Let me get that thing off because that's annoying me. Whatever. Okay. So we have from our body component that's being called for our enemy, we have our collision component. Let's go ahead and check that. We don't need to change anything for that. So we can go back to where that's called. Our state component, let's see. Okay, so here we have our state. So we could set how we want that stuff to be. Case enemy. And then we're going to do state component dot set direction, so we could default to where we're going to have it. I just want to check my previous one. All right. So we could have our state for an entity, and this could be different depending on if we don't need the states. So like a static, we'll always start it down, like a static NPC or static enemy. So let's go ahead and set the direction, and we're going to just default down for now. and we can change it. So state component dot set state, and let's make them idle. Okay, so there's our enemy. That should be, let's go back to what we call that. Okay, so that's all of it. Now, if we look at our coin, that is really annoying me. If we look at our coin, we do need to have a body. We do need to have a type. For an interactive, we don't need to know, it does not need to know that it's been collected. We can just have the player collect it. So I would say you don't need to have a collision component on that one. For the state for a coin, does it really need to change states? So if it doesn't really need to change states, then we may not need to create that state. We just have a deal with it. So we do need a body, we do need a type, and that would be about it. So let's go ahead and create that. Now with the body, we're going to have to deal with that, which will mean we are going to have a different type. So I'm going to go case, let's say coin. And this could be any type of collectible that we need. Now, there are some things that we don't need to set in here. So the category bits, this would be, now since we're adding this, we are going to have to go into our figures and add some extra pieces. So we have other level player and enemy. Let's go ahead and do the, let's do the next one, which is going to be public static final. And this is why I was saying using interactive, because you're going to run out of space. But we could say coin, and we need to do the next multiple of 2. So 16 times 2 is 32. So now we have that for coin. So going back to our collisions, our entity manager, we're going to have to set for the coin. Coin is going to be coin. And the coin is going to only be collected by the player. We could determine if we wanted it to interact with the level so that maybe it doesn't move past the level. So that may be a good idea. But then this means that the player would also be able to interact with the coin. So we're going to have to put another OR, and we're going to have to do figures.coin. Okay, so now that we have that, then we could determine what the dimensional vectors are. Right now I have it set as 1. Let me double check what I put. We could leave it as 1 right now. Body component. Right now this is going to be creating a circle the exact same size as the player. That could be changed, but we really want to just test. For the body component for those things, though, they're not really moving. So if we're building that, we can kind of change how we're doing those things. So they don't need to move because they're not going to be moving. So we could change inside our body component what that's going to look like, or inside here. So we could have that it's set as a sensor for FDEF. If you didn't want it to be interacting with the player, other than just sending the signal and then disappearing. If you wanted him to actually bounce off the coin, then maybe you don't want it to be a sensor, or for whatever you're doing. So after that, we are building it using our X and Y. It's not really moving. We could technically get rid of this line, and it's not going to change anything. Okay, so we did the body. Let's go back to coin. We got our type. We need to add that type. So case on the entity name is coin or any other collectible. We're going to say the type equals figures dot coin. So this is where I'm saying the interactive, because we can set the type even though we have that entity name, and we are kind of holding on to what that entity is. So we could add another component on there to hold something more specific. So if it's interactive, we're setting the type as interactive, but then I can say, you know, hey, this interactive is health, a power up, whatever. Okay. So this would be all the pieces that we would really need for dealing with that. Now, since we just built another piece in there, player collision would now be able to have another piece in there. So would not just interact with an enemy in a level, but could also interact with the coin. And then we are going to want to log that it interacted with the coin and what we want to do with it. So let's go here. We're going to add this so we can start seeing what's happening. Okay, so we added the type of the coin interacting. Now, in my entity manager, notice that, and let me head back, notice that when we created the coin, we did not give it a collision component, okay? So then in my collision system, I don't need to have another checking the type for if it is a coin, because I don't need the coin to deal with how it is colliding with the player. I could just have the coin get deleted from the engine and deal with the player having that extra information. Okay. So, where's my error? Okay. And then we can break out of this. All right. Okay. Now, we still didn't create that because we'd have to build it in tile to start testing, but this is where you guys would be able to do that. So your tiled map, and I'm going to do that in another video. I'm going to cut this. Your tiled map, you're going to have to add that spawn type with an enemy and with the coin so that you could see that it is interacting, and then you could start dealing with removing it from the world. So let's go ahead and we're going to do that, but I'm going to stop here. So just to kind of summarize what we did. We started building a collision system. We haven't added it to our engine yet, but we built a collision system that's going to go through and find all the entities that have a collision component, and it's going to identify if there was a collision that took place. If there was a collision that took place, then it is going to look through and find what type of entity that was, and then we can deal with the interactions that we had. If that entity didn't have a collision component, then we don't care how it collided, because it will be dealt with by the other entity. So a player and an enemy could have a collision component. The level, when we're looking at our level collision generator, does not have a collision component, just has a body, a type, and a transform. So I don't need to hold that it has collided with what it has collided with. Now I need to look. Okay. We will need to start adding for the transform when we're going to start dealing with a bunch of movements. We put it in the level collision generator, but we are going to end up, this is where we are going to be holding if we need it to disappear while we're getting ready to destroy it and all that stuff. Okay, so that is basically how we're going to set up the collision system. Then all we need to do is go into our main game screen and we can start adding that in. So main game screen, where we are adding our Ashley systems. So I'm going to go back up to the top and we want to add another system. So we're going to do private collision system, and we'll call it collision system. And then for our actually systems, we're going to have to create that system and give it all the stuff that we needed. So collision system is equal to new collision system, and we have to pass in all of the stuff. So we need to pass in our engine, we need to pass in our world, we're going to need to pass in our player and our game. And then this would be ready to run, and we add to the engine, we add that system. Add system, and we're going to put the collision system. Okay, so that will start generating. Now the way that I've built this is with the player handle, but it would be smarter not to have to hold onto the player and just check if there is a player component for that entity, instead of you passing a handle to the player in almost all your systems. So that's basically what it is for getting the collision system. Now again, we don't have the other entities to be able to test yet, so we're going to do that in the next video. All right.